Hello everybody! Welcome to English for Starters for the 11th grade, the scientific section.
Alexander Graham Bell. In this episode, we're going to talk about telephone history. Further information on the telephone.
In this lesson, we are going to complete our subject about the telephone. We are going to talk about the history of the telephone and some more additional information about the same subject.
Telephone history. The history of the telephone begins at the start of a human history. Man has always wanted to communicate from afar. People have used smoke signals, mirrors, jungle drums, carrier pigeons, and semaphore to get a message from one point to another. But a phone was something new. Francis Bacon partly predicted the telephone in 1627. However, his book, New Utopia, only described a long speaking tube. What kinds of communication did people use before the telephone was invented?
People in the past used to use smoke signals, mirrors, jungle drums, carrier pigeons, and semaphore to get a message from one point to another.
A real telephone could not be invented until the electrical age began, and even then, it didn't seem desirable. The electrical principles needed to build a telephone were known in 1831, but it wasn't until 1854 that Purcell suggested transmitting speech electrically, and it wasn't until 22 years later, in 1876, that the idea became a reality. Before then, a telephone might have been impossible to even think of.
A pioneer in the field of telecommunications, Alexander Graham Bell was born in 1847 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He moved to Ontario and then to the United States, settling in Boston before beginning his career as an inventor.
Throughout his life, Bell was interested in the education of deaf people. This interest led him to invent the microphone and, in 1876, his electrical speech machine. He set up the first telephone exchange in New Haven, Connecticut. By 1884, long-distance connections were made between Boston, Massachusetts, and New York City.
What was Alexander Graham Bell interested in throughout his life?
Throughout his life, Alexander Graham Bell was interested in the education of deaf people. This interest led him to invent the microphone.
What was the telephone called originally?
Originally, the telephone was called the electrical speech machine.
Bell imagined great uses for his telephone. But would he ever have imagined telephone lines being used to transmit video images? Since his death in 1922, the telecommunication industry has undergone an amazing revolution. Today, deaf people are able to use a special display telephone to communicate.
What are deaf people able to use today for communication?
Today, deaf people are able to use a special display telephone to communicate.
Fiber optics are improving the quality and speed of data transmission. Actually, your ability to access this information relies upon telecommunications technology. Bell's electrical speech machine paved the way for the information superhighway.
Further information on the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell was an acoustics expert with an understanding of electricity. When he first thought of the principle that the telephone would be based on, he went to the famous inventor Joseph Henry, who inspired him to continue its development. He acquired financial backing and hired Thomas Watson, an electrical designer and mechanic, as his assistant. They were able to combine their expertise, and with the help of their lawyers, they created and patented the first telephone. Although there was still a lot of work to be done, Bell and his team went on to become very wealthy men.
On the 14th of February 1876, while Bell was away in Boston, his lawyers filed the patent for his device at the patent's office. They were only hours ahead of Elisha Gray, a rival competitor. 3 days later, the patent was issued. Bell experimented with a water transmitter using a mixture of acid and water. It was while using this that Thomas Watson clearly heard the famous line, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Here we come to the end of this episode. For any questions or suggestions, please contact us on the following addresses. See you. Bye-bye.